So, hi everyone, welcome back. So, let's continue our Eon topic, which is targeted. So, let's start with the subtopic, which is psychiatrists become equally disenchanted with the serotonin theory of depression. So, let's see what this subtopic holds for us. Let's start with the four spaces of this subtopic. The drugs eventually took a toll on his body. The specific combination of medication, lithium, and thyroidazine is now known to be neurotoxic. His motor problems worsened and led to antipsychotic induced dysphagia. I don't know if I'm spelling the medical term correctly or not. A condition in which your brain is unable to regulate the thin slice of tissue that stop foods and water from entering your lungs. Dysphagia contributed to his death in 2005 by pneumonia. So, this passage is talking about the condition of the author's father, right? So, he said the drugs, how the drugs affect his body. That drugs contains a lithium and thyroxine, which is now known to be a neurotoxic, and which makes his motor problem worsen, which leads to the antipsychotic induced dysphagia, in which the condition of the brain is unable to regulate the thin slice of tissue that stop the food and water from entering your lungs, and resulting he lost his life in the year 2005 by pneumonia. So that's the things author describing about how he or she lost his father or her father. So let's moving towards what happens next. It would be one thing if the medical vision were true. Fact that TI's rebel against the broken brain narrative would be no more surprising than that someone can be in denial about diabetes or cancer. But the past 3 decades have shown that psychiatry's medical vision is neither scientifically credible nor morally sound. So, your author is saying that it's a fact that the TI rebels against the broken brain narrative, which would no more surprising than someone can be denial about diabetes or cancer. Now, author says that it's been a past 3 decades. Now it shows that the psychiatric medical vision and the scientific medical vision is neither scientifically credible nor morally sound. So it's overall is that it's not that much of efficient. It's moving toward the next basis. What happens next? Where in the upper two bases we don't need to take something important, or we can say that the one line we can that the psychiatric medical vision is neither scientifically credible nor morally sound. That we can take. Otherwise, nothing we can understand what happens. The story. So moving toward the next spaces, the scientific problem came first. Even 20 years after Sinedo's breakthrough paper, nobody could find the smoking gun, the supposed dopamine abnormality in patients who would never taken antipsychotic drugs. Moreover, a new generation of drugs, the so-called atypicals, took a much larger share of psychiatric drugs market. They seems to manage symptoms equally well with the fewer side effects, even though they targeted a much wider profile of chemicals than dopamine. Dopamine began to look like one small piece of much larger puzzle. Psychiatrists become equally disenchanted with the serotonin theory of depression. Today, the idea that these drugs work by the reversing chemical imbalance appears increasingly groundless. So, in this passage, author is saying that firstly, the scientific problem came into the picture first. After the Sendro Spectro, a paper. That is, nobody could find the smoking gun, and which is about a dopamine abnormalities in patients who would never taken antipsychotic drugs. Even now, the new generation drug, which is so-called atypicals, took a larger shares in psychiatric drugs market. And these atypicals manage the symptoms equally well with the fewer side effects. But they have a much wider profile of chemicals than dopamine. And the dopamine role here is a very small piece of a larger puzzle. Now, in the today's era, the drugs works reversing a chemical imbalance, which have no reason, no grounds, no base. So, what the title should given to this passage is scientific problem. We can just say how identification of scientific problem is a best suited title given to this particular passage. And what important line we can take from here is that firstly, the no one could find the smoking gun, and the another one is new generation of drugs, so-called atypicals, took a much larger shares of psychiatric drugs market, which manage the symptoms equally with the few side effects, even though they targeted a much wider profile of chemicals than dopamine. Dopamine, one small piece of much larger puzzle. And the psychiatrists become equally disenchanting with the serotonin theory of depression. Works by reversing chemical imbalance appear increasingly groundless. Let's moving toward the next process. If the scientific credibility of the medical vision is waning, its political justification is also eroded. Over the past decades, a new generation of psychologists have been studying the nature of mental health stigma, what it is, how it's created, how to solve it. The consensus of this research is that psychiatry's medical vision and its language of chemical imbalance, brain circuit defect, genetic abnormalities, and so on merely a replace of one kind of stigma for another. So it's this passage is about the new generation study about psychology or the nature of the mental health, how it's created, how to solve this. And what they found in this research is that in a psychiatric medical vision, this mental health stigma is called as a chemical imbalance, brain circuit defects, genetic abnormalities, and so on. So, what title should given to this species is research on nature of mental health stigma by new generation psychologists. And what we can take from here, psychiatric medical reasons It's a language of chemical imbalance, brain circuit defect, and genetic abnormalities. They are merely the replaces of one kind of stigma for another. That's all for this species. Let's moving toward the next one. In particular, medical narrative tends to trigger three narratives outcomes. They make other people want to distance themselves from the patients. They make patients pessimistic about their own recovery, and they evoke in the patient's mind the idea that drugs are the optimal course of treatment. Perhaps the most troubling finding of the new research is that stigma toward schizophrenia, meso as a desire for social distance, has actually increased over the past 30 years, plausibly due to the great acceptance of medical narrative. So the passage given to this, the title given to this particular passage is the negative three negative outcomes of medical narratives. Where the author is talking about, they makes the people want to distance themselves from these patients, this kind of patients, and even they make a patient pessimistic about their own recovery. And the last one is that patients' minds, the idea that drugs are optimal course of treatment only. So, what important line we can take from this passage is, make other people want to distance themselves from the patients, make patients pessimistic about their own recovery, the idea that evoke patients' mind, the idea that drugs are the optimal course of treatment, and the stigma towards schizophrenia measured as a desire for social distance. Why? Because of the acceptance of the medical narratives. So let's moving toward the next species. Academic psychiatrists today often claim that psychiatry has already moved away from the narrow biomedical visions of the 1980s. They saw that psychiatry has instead embraced a more holistic biopsychosocial vision that respect all the different factors, brain imbalance, childhood trauma, social injustice that make us unwell. Aren't psychiatry's critics just beating a dead horse? So here, since the author is criticized, or we can say the make a fun of that in today's academic psychiatrists, they they say that now they moved away from the narrow narrative of the biomedical vision of 1980s. That now they embrace a more holistic biopsychosocial vision that respect all differences, different factors, just like brain imbalance, childhood trauma, social injustice. But now author making fun by saying that aren't the psychiatrists critics just beating a dead horse. Like, now it doesn't make sense. That time is also doesn't make sense. Now you're saying all these things to just make yourself that you're more valuable now, but it's not that true. So what the title should give into this species? And now in the current belief or vision of academic psychiatrist, what we can say that already moved away from the narrow biomedical vision of the 1980s, respect all of the different factors, brain imbalance, childhood trauma, and social injustice that make us unwell. So let's moving toward the next business. But this reassurance rang hollow to me. Despite the calls for a more holistic model, in practice, interventions for people like Luca have changed very little since the 1990s, with its short cycles of hospitalization, diagnosis, drugs, and monitoring. Psychiatry journals are increasingly dominated by biological perspective to the exclusion of psychological and social ones. And the fact that about one fourth of the US college students are on antidepressant drugs, and about a third of Scottish adults are on some form of psychiatric medication suggests that, if anything, psychiatry's medical vision is actually more entrenched now than it was in 1990. So, here what author is saying, but these reassurance rings hollow to me. Despite the call for a more holistic model in practice, interventions for people like Luca have changed very little since the 1990s. So, author says that in the above passages, the academic psychiatrists claim that now they moved on from the narrow belief of psychiatric medical visions of 1980s, but now it's make a very little change in the persons like Luca in the year 1990s. And why it's very little change? Of author just explained in the continuing sentences. With its short cycle of hospitalization, diagnosis, drugs, and monitoring, now the author is saying that psychiatric journey has an increasingly dominating by biological perspective to the exclusion of psychological and social ones. So, what the author is saying here that the psychiatric journey are increasingly dominating by biological perspective, not the psychological and the social one. And why he is saying this? And the fact that about one fifth of US college students are on antidepressant drugs, and about a third of the Scottish adults are on some form of psychiatric medications. So earlier, that academic psychiatrists claim that they are now the completely changed person. They respect uh, the differences, but the fact is saying the things completely opposite. By presenting the fact, author says that the, about one fifth of US college students are on antidepressant drugs, and about the third of the Scottish adults are on some form of psychiatric medications. So, how the condition is changed? Don't you think that the condition is even worse than the earlier ones? So, suggested that if anything, psychiatric medical vision is actually more entrenched now than it was in 1980. So, even the condition is worse than the previous one. So, what is the title should give in to this particular passage? That how, why author criticize the new time academic psychiatrist belief. First, psychiatric journals are increasingly dominated by the biological perspective to the exclusion of psychological and the social one. And the one fifth of the US college students are on antidepressant drugs, and about a third of the Scottish adults are on some form of psychiatric medication. The psychiatric medical vision is actually more entrenched now than it was in the 1990s. So let's moving toward the next. But if psychiatric medical vision is failing, TIs like Luca, what should we replace it with? How can we break out this bind? So your author is questioning as psychiatric medical vision is failing, what happened? How we replace TIs like Luca? How can break this kind of stereotypes? Okay, let's moving toward the next pieces then. How what author trying to explain is the next. Despite the entrenchment of the medical vision, my recent exploration of the psychological, social, and spiritual approaches to the psychosis have made me optimistic about the future. I think we are at the beginning of a renaissance of the alternative approach that loosely resemble the plurality of paradigms in the 1960s. The ultimate goal of these movements is to create safe, non-coercive, therapeutic communities that give people space to explore alternative meaning, making frameworks and ethos embodied in soteria House, the Open Dialogue Framework, and Inner Fire, among others. One of the leading organizations in this context is the Global Hearing Voices Network, which encourages people to understand their voices and other unusual experience, now as symptoms of disease, but a source of creativity, inspiration, and insight. So, what author is saying in this space is despite the entrenchment of the medical vision, my recent explorations of psychological, social, and spiritual approaches to psychosis have made me optimistic about the future. As we say that the one reason or one factor of the TI communities and how to approach a TI community is a medical one. Now the other three one is the psychological, social, and spiritual approaches. So author is saying that although he's not happy with the medical visions, but he recently explored the psychological, social, and spiritual approaches to this psychosis, which made him optimistic about the future and how it is. So let's read. Sorry. I think we are at the beginning of a renaissance of alternative approach that loosely resemble the plurality of paradigm in the 1960s. So author is saying that now we we are in the beginning of getting an alternative approach to deal with that kind of disease, that kind of functions of the brain or conditions which is completely less resemble to the paradigm of the 1960s. The ultimate goal of this movement is to create a safe, non-coercive, therapeutic community that gives people space to explore alternative, meaning-making framework and ethos embodied in Soteria House, the Open Dialogue Framework, and the Inner Fire, among others. So here author is saying that the ultimate goal of this movement is to create a safe, coercive, and therapeutic community to these kind of a people so that they can freely explore the alternatives with meaning making frameworks, which is open dialogue framework and inner fire, among others. One of the leading organizations in this context is the Global Hearing Voices Network, which encourages people to understand their voices and other unusual experience not as a symptom of disease but as a source of creativity, inspiration, and insights. So here is talking author is talking about one of the organization which named a Global Hearing Voices Network. This organizations help these people to understand their voices, other unusual experiences, not as a symptoms of disease, but as a source of creativity, inspiration, and insights. So what title should given to this particular passage is why author is optimistic about social, psychological, social and spiritual approaches. And what we can take from this passage is first is create safe, non-coercive therapeutic community that gives people space to explore alternatives, meaning-making framework and ethos. Yeah, that was and global hearing voices network which encourage people to understand their voices and other usual experiences not as a symptom of a disease but a source of creativity, inspiration, and insights. So let's moving toward the next phases. One avenue of intensive exploration is that experience, such as threatening voices, unusual belief, and dissociative episodes, are protective response to traumatic experience. Although popular book like Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, which is written in the year 2014, remain controversial. What's no longer controversial is a link between a childhood abuse and neglect and adult experience of psychosis. Hence, the popular slogan that we should no longer ask patient, "What's wrong with you?" but "What happens to you?" The idea that terrifying experience like Luca's can be a coherent response to abuse or neglect has been developed by organizations such as Hearing Voices Network, the National Paranoia Network, and the Power Treats Meaning Frame. So in this passage, this author is talking about how different books, different authors, and different community and organizations help these peoples. Firstly, the author is talking about the popular book Wessel van der Kolk's "Body Keep the Score," which is written in the year 2040, which is a controversial, but it has a very good link. A link between a childhood abuse and neglect and adult experience of psychosis. It has a popular slogan that we should not longer ask the patient what's wrong with you, but what happens to you. The idea that terrifying experience like Luca can be coherent response to abuse or neglect has been developed by organizations such as the Hearing Voices Network, the National Paranoia Network, and the Power Treat Meaningfully. So, what title should given to this thesis is how the organizations and books help these peoples or protect these peoples. So what we can take from here, firstly, these things brings a protective response to the traumatic experiences. The pen vessels ventricles, the body keeps scores, a link between a childhood abuse and neglect and adults experience of psychosis, hence popular slogan that we should, from that book we can say that we should no longer ask patient what's wrong with you but what happens to you. The idea that terrifying experience has been developed by organizations such as Hearing Voices Networks, the National Paranoia Network, and the powerful threat meaning frame. So let's moving toward the next and the last basis of today's video. A second approach sees psychosis as spiritual emergency. This view is advanced today by organizations like Safely Held Spaces and the International Spiritual Emergence Network. While some of a materialistic mindset scoff at the idea that psychosis has a spiritual dimension, these framing have powerful practical benefits. Cross-cultural research on the schizophrenia has shown that the way culture makes sense of voice hearing impact both the content and the emotional tone of the voices. In the US, where voice hearing in the content of schizophrenia is framed as symptom of a disease, voices are experienced as more invasive, hostile and distressing. And part of India, Ghana, and China, where voices tends to be understood as belonging to deceased ancestor or other spirits. Voices are experienced as more benevolent and less scary. Some voices hearers have found that simply by adopting a curious and compassionate attitude to what the voices are trying to say, they become a less threatening and more supportive. So this passage is talking about how spiritual emergency psychosis approach work, and it was advanced today by the organization like Safely Held Spaces and International Spiritual Emergency Network. And other is that some materialistic mindsets scoff at the idea that psychosis has a spiritual dimension. This framing have a powerful practical benefit. And the cross-cultural research on the schizophrenia shows that the way culture makes sense of voice hearing impact both the content and the emotional tone of the voices. In the US, where the voice hearing is the content of schizophrenia is a framed as a symptoms of disease, voices as experiences more invasive, hostile, and distressing in parts of India, Ghana, and China, where the voices tends to be understood as belonging to deceased ancestor or other spirits. Voices are experienced as more benevolent and less scary. So here is author is saying that in US the voices, the unusual voices experiences by the persons of psychosis is look at in the two different terms. In US, it's look at a disease, but in the part of India, Ghana, and China, it's belongs to the deceased ancestor, voice of deceased ancestor, other spirits. Voices are experienced as more benevolent and less scary. They are considering it as a spiritual things, not a disease. Some voice hearers have found that simply by adopting a crucial, compassionate attitude to what the voices are trying to say, they become less threatening and more supportive. So these part of the country says that if you just simply understand what those voices are trying to say, that so now it's become supportive, not the threat. What they're trying to signal you, what they're trying to tell you. So suitable title given to this passage is How the Spiritual Emergency Approach Look Likes in Today's Era. Firstly, the sum of the materialistic minds scoff at the idea that psychosis has spiritual dimension. This framing has have a powerful practical benefits. The cross-cultural research on the schizophrenia has shown that the way culture makes sense of voice hearing impact both the content and emotional tone of the voices. In US, voice hearing is the context of schizophrenia framed as symptom of disease. The part of India, Ghana, China, where the voices tends to understood as the belonging to deceased in the ancestors, or the spirits' voices are experienced as more spirits, and voices are experienced as more benevolent and less scary. Adopting a curious and a compassionate attitude to what the voices are trying to say, they become less threatening and more supportive. So that's all for today. Hope you guys understand the passage more. See you tomorrow with the continuation of this year topic. As of now, have a great day and thank you.